Marcus Thompson had always been a quiet neighbor, the kind of man who kept his lawn perfectly trimmed, never played music too loud, and always returned borrowed tools in better condition than he received them. Living in the upscale Meadowbrook Heights subdivision for 3 years, he had managed to stay under the radar of the Homeowners Association and its overzealous president, Karen Whitfield. Karen had appointed herself the unofficial guardian of neighborhood perfection. At 52, she had short blonde hair that never seemed out of place, wore pressed khakis like a uniform, and carried a clipboard everywhere she went. Her daily routine included a morning walk that was less about exercise and more about inspection. She measured grass height with a ruler, photographed any visible trash cans past pickup day, and maintained a detailed log of every perceived violation. Marcus worked from home as a consultant, though none of his neighbors knew exactly what kind of consulting he did. He drove a modest sedan, wore simple clothes, and seemed to have a flexible schedule. What they didn't know was that Marcus Thompson was actually Marcus T. Richardson, the newly appointed Director of Housing Community Standards for the Federal Housing Administration. His job involved overseeing homeowner association compliance across the entire United States. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in late September. Marcus had ordered a new desk for his home office, and the delivery truck was larger than usual. The driver, running behind schedule, parked the truck in front of Marcus's house, partially blocking the sidewalk. The delivery took exactly 12 minutes, but that was enough time for Karen to spot the violation from her kitchen window. She marched outside, clipboard in hand, and began taking photographs from every angle. When Marcus came out to help guide the delivery men, Karen was already measuring the distance between the truck and the curb with a tape measure. "Excuse me," Karen called out, her voice sharp with authority. "Commercial vehicles are not permitted in this neighborhood between the hours of 8 a.m. and 6 p.m., according to our HOA Covenant Section 4.2.7. Marcus looked up from signing for the delivery. "Good morning, Karen. It's just a furniture delivery. The truck will be gone in a few minutes." "That's Mrs. Whitfield to you," she snapped, writing furiously on her clipboard. "And a few minutes is still a violation. This truck is also blocking pedestrian access to the sidewalk, which violates City Ordinance 847.3. The delivery men exchanged glances and hurried to finish unloading the desk. Marcus remained calm, though he noticed Karen was now taking pictures of his house number, the truck's license plate, and even the delivery receipt in his hands. "I understand your concern about following the rules," Marcus said diplomatically. "The truck will be moving shortly." "Don't patronize me," Karen replied, her face reddening. "You think because you keep to yourself that you can just ignore the rules the rest of us follow?" "I've been watching you, Thompson. Your garbage cans were out until 7:15 p.m. last Thursday, and your newspaper sits in your driveway until sometimes 10 a.m. on Sundays." Marcus raised an eyebrow. He hadn't realized his every move was being monitored with such precision. "I work late sometimes and sleep in on weekends. I didn't realize that was affecting anyone." "It affects everyone when people like you think the rules don't apply to them," Karen said, taking one final picture as the delivery truck pulled away. "You'll be receiving a formal notice of violation in the mail. Multiple violations, actually." As Karen marched back to her house, Marcus stood in his driveway holding his delivery receipt. He had dealt with difficult HOA presidents before in his professional capacity, but experiencing it firsthand was different. He pulled out his phone and made a mental note to have someone from his office run a compliance check on the Meadowbrook Heights HOA. That afternoon, Marcus received an email from Karen with the subject line, "Urgent, multiple violations recorded." The message detailed 5 separate infractions, complete with timestamps and photographic evidence. The violations ranged from the delivery truck incident to his grass being allegedly 3.2 inches tall in some spots when the HOA limit was 3 inches. Marcus sat back in his chair and shook his head. In his 3 years of federal housing work, he had seen thousands of HOA complaints, but this level of nitpicking was extreme even by his standards. He decided to respond professionally, acknowledging receipt of the email and asking for clarification on the specific measurements and ordinances cited. Karen's response came within an hour, this time copying what appeared to be the entire HOA board. The tone was even more aggressive, questioning Marcus's attitude problem and suggesting that people who couldn't follow simple rules might be happier living elsewhere. That evening, Marcus went for a walk around the neighborhood. He noticed several other homes with grass that looked identical in height to his, garbage cans that weren't perfectly aligned, and newspaper delivery boxes that seemed randomly placed. It appeared Karen's enforcement was selective, and he was wondering if he had somehow ended up on her personal watch list. When he returned home, he found a handwritten note tucked under his windshield wiper. In Karen's precise handwriting, it read, "Your car has been parked 14 inches from the curb for the past 2 hours. HOA parking guidelines require 12 inches maximum. This is your informal warning." Marcus measured the distance with a tape measure from his garage. His car was parked exactly 13 inches from the curb. Well within normal parameters for street parking, but apparently not within Karen's interpretation of the HOA rules. As he headed inside for the night, Marcus made a decision. Tomorrow he would start his own investigation into the Meadowbrook Heights HOA and its enforcement practices. What Karen didn't know was that her newest target had the authority to investigate every aspect of how her HOA operated and the power to shut it down if necessary. The next morning, Marcus decided to test Karen's commitment to rule enforcement. He intentionally left his garbage can out 15 minutes past the designated pickup time and placed his newspaper on his front step instead of bringing it inside immediately. Then he sat by his window with his coffee, waiting. Karen appeared at 7:47 a.m., right on schedule. She photographed the garbage can, measured its distance from the house, and even lifted the lid to check if it was completely empty. When she spotted the newspaper, she took 3 pictures from different angles and wrote extensive notes on her clipboard. Marcus's phone buzzed with an email notification at 8:23 a.m. Karen had sent another violation notice, this time with a subject line reading, "Escalating pattern of deliberate noncompliance." The email was longer than the previous one, suggesting that Marcus was showing flagrant disrespect for community standards and warning that continued violations would result in fines. What interested Marcus most was the language Karen used. Several phrases in her emails matched almost word for word with template violation letters his office had flagged as potentially problematic in other HOA cases. It suggested she was either copying from questionable sources or had received training from organizations that pushed aggressive enforcement tactics. That afternoon, Marcus made a few phone calls to his office. Within an hour, he had a complete file on the Meadowbrook Heights HOA sent to his personal email. The information was enlightening and troubling. The HOA had been incorporated only 5 years ago, when Karen Whitfield had successfully petitioned to create it after moving to the neighborhood. Before that, Meadowbrook Heights had been a simple subdivision with basic city ordinances and no homeowners association. Karen had convinced residents that an HOA would protect their property, values, and maintain community standards. What the residents hadn't realized was that Karen had structured the HOA bylaws to give the president nearly unlimited enforcement authority. The board of directors existed mainly on paper, with Karen making most decisions unilaterally. More concerning, the HOA had collected over $180,000 in fees over the past 3 years, but Marcus could only account for about $23,000 in legitimate expenses. The financial record showed payments to Neighborhood Standards Consulting LLC for $4,200 per month. A quick business registration search revealed that Karen Whitfield was the sole owner of Neighborhood Standards Consulting LLC. She had essentially been paying herself a full-time salary from HOA funds to enforce rules on her neighbors. Marcus also discovered that the HOA had filed 847 violation notices in the past year alone, affecting nearly every household in the 156-home subdivision. The fines generated had totaled over $31,000, with some residents facing penalties that seemed wildly disproportionate to minor infractions. Most disturbing of all, Marcus found records showing that 3 families had been forced to sell their homes and move after being unable to pay accumulated HOA fines and legal fees. One family had faced over $8,000 in penalties for violations, including excessive holiday decorations and non-conforming mailbox color. That evening, Marcus decided to attend the monthly HOA board meeting, which was being held in Karen's living room. When he arrived, he found only 4 other residents in attendance, all looking uncomfortable and defeated. Karen sat behind a card table covered with manila folders and legal documents. She wore a navy blue blazer and had arranged the furniture to create a formal meeting atmosphere in her home. The other board members, Marcus learned, were Karen's next-door neighbor Bill, who seemed to agree with everything she said, and elderly Mrs. Patterson, who appeared confused about why she was there. "We have a new attendee tonight," Karen announced when Marcus entered. "Mr. Thompson, I hope you're here to discuss your recent pattern of violations." "Actually, I'm here to learn more about how the HOA operates," Marcus replied, taking a seat in the back row. "I'd like to understand the financial structure and decision-making process." Karen's smile became noticeably strained. "Financial matters are handled by the board. Residents can request information through proper channels if they have concerns." "What are the proper channels?" asked Marcus. "You submit a written request which the board reviews at the next scheduled meeting," Karen replied. "If the request is approved, information may be provided within 30 to 60 days. Marcus nodded, making mental notes. Under federal guidelines, HOA financial records should be available to residents within a reasonable time frame, typically no more than 10 business days. Karen's process seemed designed to discourage residents from asking questions. The meeting continued with Karen reading a list of recent violations. Marcus was surprised to hear his name mentioned 6 times, including infractions he wasn't aware of committing. According to Karen, his outdoor light had been on past 11 p.m. on 3 occasions. His car had been improperly positioned in his driveway, and he had failed to trim bushes that were allegedly exceeding height limits. When the meeting ended, Marcus approached Mrs. Patterson, who seemed overwhelmed by the proceedings. "Have you been involved with the HOA long?" he asked gently. "Oh, I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to be doing," she admitted. "Karen asked me to be on the board after my husband died. She said it would help me stay connected to the community, but I don't understand all these rules and numbers." Marcus realized that Karen had essentially appointed a grieving widow to the board position, likely knowing that Mrs. Patterson wouldn't question her decisions or ask difficult questions about the HOA's operations. As he walked home, Marcus's phone rang. It was his assistant from the Federal Housing Office. "Marcus, I've been doing some research on that HOA you asked about. You need to know that we've received 3 formal complaints about Meadowbrook Heights in the past 6 months. All 3 alleged financial mismanagement and excessive enforcement. I was about to recommend a full federal investigation." Marcus stopped walking. "What kind of complaints?" "Residents claiming they're being forced out of their homes through excessive fines. One family said they were charged $500 for having their Christmas lights up 2 days past the arbitrary deadline. Another was fined $300 for parking in their own driveway at an angle Karen deemed inappropriate." Marcus looked back at Karen's house, where lights were still on and he could see her silhouette moving around, probably preparing more violation notices for tomorrow's delivery. "Go ahead and open the federal investigation," Marcus told his assistant, "and make sure it's thorough. I think we're going to find some serious problems here." What Karen didn't realize was that her newest target was about to become her biggest problem. The escalation began on Friday morning when Marcus found a certified letter in his mailbox. Karen had sent him a formal notice of intent to file legal action for his accumulated violations, which now totaled $1,147 in fines. The letter demanded payment within 10 days, or the HOA would begin legal proceedings to place a lien on his property. Marcus read through the charges carefully. Some were legitimate minor infractions, like leaving his garbage can out too long. Others seemed completely fabricated. One charge claimed he had painted his front door without HOA approval, even though the door had been the same color since before he moved in. Another claimed his driveway had unauthorized oil stains that were actually shadows from his car. The most ridiculous charge was a $400 fine for disrupting neighborhood peace because his home office printer could allegedly be heard from the sidewalk during quiet hours between 8 p.m. and 8 a.m. Marcus had printed exactly one document at 8:15 p.m. the previous Tuesday. Instead of getting angry, Marcus smiled. Karen had just made a serious mistake. Under federal housing regulations, HOAs must provide detailed evidence for any fines exceeding $200, including photographic proof and witness statements. They also cannot charge fines for activities that occurred before a resident received written notice of the specific rule being violated. More importantly, Karen's threat to place a lien on his property triggered federal oversight requirements. Any HOA attempting to foreclose on a home must notify federal housing authorities and prove that due process was followed throughout the enforcement action. Marcus spent the weekend documenting everything. He photographed his front door, showing that the paint was clearly weathered and several years old. He checked his printer's sound levels and found that it couldn't be heard from inside his own house, let alone from the sidewalk. He gathered receipts and timestamps proving that several alleged violations had occurred when he wasn't even home. On Monday morning, Marcus called Karen's number, which was listed on all HOA correspondence. "Mrs. Whitfield, this is Marcus Thompson. I received your legal notice and I have some questions about the charges." "Mr. Thompson," Karen's voice was cold and professional. "All violations were properly documented according to HOA procedures. If you wish to dispute any charges, you can request a hearing with the board." "I'd like to request that hearing," Marcus said. "I'd also like to review the evidence supporting these charges, particularly the witness statements and photographic documentation required for fines over $200. There was a long pause. "Evidence will be presented at the hearing. Actually, under HOA regulations, residents have the right to review evidence before the hearing. I'll also need copies of the specific rules that were allegedly violated, with the dates those rules were adopted and how residents were notified of them." Karen's tone became noticeably sharper. "Mr. Thompson, I don't appreciate your confrontational attitude. These violations are clear-cut, and your attempts to find technicalities won't change that." "I'm not looking for technicalities," Marcus replied calmly. "I'm asking for the same due process that any resident deserves. When can I schedule a time to review the evidence?" After more back and forth, Karen grudgingly agreed to meet with Marcus on Wednesday evening to review the violation documentation. She insisted the meeting take place at her home with the other board members present. Marcus spent Tuesday evening preparing for the meeting. He printed out federal guidelines for HOA enforcement procedures, legal precedents for due process in homeowner disputes, and documentation standards for community association fines. He also prepared a list of questions about the HOA's financial structure and Karen's consulting company. Wednesday evening arrived, and Marcus knocked on Karen's front door at exactly 7 p.m. Karen answered wearing the same navy blazer from the previous board meeting, with her clipboard and a stack of manila folders arranged on her dining room table. Bill, the neighbor board member, sat uncomfortably on the couch. Mrs. Patterson was not present, which Marcus found interesting since she was supposedly a board member. "Where is Mrs. Patterson?" Marcus asked. "She couldn't make it tonight," Karen replied quickly. "She's not feeling well." Marcus suspected that Karen had deliberately not invited Mrs. Patterson, possibly because she knew the elderly woman might ask inconvenient questions or express sympathy for Marcus's situation. Karen opened the first folder with dramatic flair. "Let's start with the most serious violation. Unauthorized exterior modifications to your property without HOA approval." She pulled out a photograph of Marcus's front door. The image was grainy and appeared to have been taken from across the street with a zoom lens. "This photograph clearly shows that your front door has been painted a different color than it was when you moved in," Karen declared. Marcus pulled out his own photograph taken that morning in clear daylight. "Mrs. Whitfield, this is the same door taken with better lighting. You can see the paint is weathered and faded. There are even areas where the old color is showing through. This door hasn't been painted in years." Karen studied both photographs, her confidence wavering slightly. "Well, it appears different in certain lighting. Do you have any evidence that I actually painted this door? Purchase receipts for paint? Witnesses who saw me painting? Before and after photographs?" "I don't need witnesses for obvious violations," Karen snapped. "Actually, you do," Marcus replied, pulling out a printed document. "According to federal guidelines for homeowner association enforcement, any fine over $200 requires documented evidence, including photographic proof of the violation, and either witness statements or clear documentation of the rule-breaking activity." Karen's face reddened. "We don't need to follow federal guidelines. We're a private homeowner association. All HOAs that affect property ownership rights are subject to federal oversight," Marcus explained patiently, "especially when those HOAs attempt to place liens on properties or threaten foreclosure." The meeting continued with Marcus systematically challenging each violation. Karen had no witness statements, no documentation of rule adoption dates, and no evidence for most of the more expensive charges. Her photographs were often unclear or taken from extreme distances. When Marcus asked to see financial records showing how the HOA's money was being spent, Karen became defensive. Financial matters are confidential board business, she insisted. Not when residents are being charged fees and fines, Marcus replied. Homeowners have a legal right to understand how their money is being used, especially when it's funding a consulting company owned by the HOA president. Karen's face went white. How did you know about that? It's public record, Marcus said simply. What I'm wondering is whether the residents know that their HOA fees are being used to pay the president a salary for enforcing rules on them. Bill, who had been silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke up. Wait, what? Karen, you're paying yourself with HOA money? The meeting ended abruptly with Karen claiming she felt attacked and asking Marcus to leave. As he walked home, Marcus felt satisfied that he had exposed significant problems with Karen's enforcement methods and financial arrangements. What he didn't expect was Karen's response the next morning. Instead of backing down, she had decided to escalate the situation to a level that would prove to be a catastrophic mistake. Thursday morning at 6:47 a.m., Marcus was awakened by loud knocking on his front door. He looked out the window to see two police officers standing on his porch, with Karen Whitfield hovering behind them on his front walkway. Marcus quickly threw on clothes and opened the door. The older officer, Sergeant Rodriguez, looked apologetic. Sir, we received a complaint about possible fraud and theft occurring at this address. The complainant says you've been stealing HOA funds and threatening board members. Marcus blinked in surprise, then looked past the officers at Karen, who was standing with her arms crossed and a satisfied expression on her face. Officers, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I haven't stolen anything and I certainly haven't threatened anyone. He's lying, Karen interjected. Last night he came to my home and threatened me when I tried to collect legitimate fines. He said he had connections that could shut down our HOA and destroy our community. Sergeant Rodriguez held up his hand to quiet Karen. Sir, can we come in and talk about this? Marcus invited the officers inside, offering them coffee and explaining the situation calmly. He showed them the violation notices, the photographs from their evidence review meeting, and the federal guidelines he had printed out. So you work in housing? Asked the younger officer, Officer Chen. I'm a consultant, Marcus replied, sticking to his cover story. I help people understand their rights when dealing with homeowner associations. Karen, who had somehow invited herself into Marcus's house, was pacing around his living room. See? He admits he's some kind of professional troublemaker. He moved here specifically to cause problems for law-abiding residents. Sergeant Rodriguez was examining the violation notices. Ma'am, these charges do seem excessive. $1,400 for having garbage cans in the wrong position? It's about maintaining standards, Karen huffed. When people like him ignore the rules, it affects everyone's property values. Officer Chen picked up one of the federal guideline documents Marcus had printed. Sir, how did you know about these specific regulations? Marcus realized he was walking a fine line. I research this stuff when I'm dealing with housing disputes. It's all publicly available information. He's probably not even a real resident, Karen declared. I think he moved here under false pretenses to scam our HOA. You should check his identification and verify that he actually owns this house. The officers exchanged glances. Officer Chen stepped outside to run Marcus's information through their system, while Sergeant Rodriguez continued asking questions about the HOA dispute. Mr. Thompson, did you tell Mrs. Whitfield that you could shut down the HOA? I mentioned that HOAs can face federal oversight if they don't follow proper procedures. Marcus replied carefully. I never threatened her or claimed I personally could shut anything down. Karen was now examining Marcus's home office, which was visible from the living room. His desk had multiple monitors, legal documents, and what appeared to be official government paperwork. What kind of consulting do you do exactly? She asked suspiciously, moving closer to his desk. Marcus stepped between Karen and his office. Housing policy research. Nothing that concerns you. Officer Chen returned from his patrol car with a puzzled expression. Sir, your information came back a little unusual. It shows your address and confirms you own this home, but there's a federal flag on your record. Nothing criminal, but it says to contact a specific number if there are any legal issues involving you. Marcus felt his stomach drop. His cover was about to be blown and he wasn't sure how to handle it. What kind of federal flag? Karen demanded, her eyes lighting up with vindication. I knew something was suspicious about him. Ma'am, I need you to wait outside while we sort this out, Sergeant Rodriguez said firmly. This is between us and Mr. Thompson now. Karen protested loudly but was escorted to the front porch. Officer Chen called the number from his patrol car while Sergeant Rodriguez stayed with Marcus. "Sir, I need to ask you directly. Do you work for the federal government?" Marcus made a decision. The investigation was going to happen anyway, and Karen had just accelerated the timeline by involving law enforcement. "Yes, I do. I work for the Federal Housing Administration. I oversee homeowner association compliance across the United States." Sergeant Rodriguez's eyebrows went up. "And you live here in this neighborhood?" "I moved here before I took the federal job. I've been keeping a low profile, but Mrs. Whitfield's enforcement tactics caught my attention professionally." Officer Chen returned from his car. "Sir, I just spoke with your supervisor at FHA. She confirmed your identity and said you're currently conducting an authorized investigation of this HOA. She also said Karen Whitfield is about to have a very bad day." Through the front window, they could see Karen pacing on the porch, talking animatedly on her cell phone. She appeared to be calling someone, probably another board member or perhaps her lawyer. "Officers, I apologize for the confusion," Marcus said. "I should have identified myself earlier, but I was trying to maintain my investigation without creating a disturbance." "What exactly are you investigating?" asked Sergeant Rodriguez. Marcus pulled out a thick folder from his desk. "Financial mismanagement, illegal fee structures, violations of due process, and possible fraud. Mrs. Whitfield has been paying herself over $50,000 per year from HOA funds through a shell consulting company. She's also been imposing fines that violate federal guidelines and threatening residents with foreclosure for minor infractions." Officer Chen whistled softly. "No wonder she wanted us to arrest you. She probably thinks you're going to send her to prison." "The investigation will determine what charges are appropriate," Marcus replied. "But calling the police and making false accusations against a federal investigator was definitely not her smartest move." Sergeant Rodriguez looked out at Karen, who was still on her phone. "Should we tell her who you are?" Marcus considered this. "Not yet. Let me call my office and get some additional investigators out here. I think Mrs. Whitfield is about to find out that there are consequences for harassment and filing false police reports." As the officers prepared to leave, Karen rushed back to the door. "Are you arresting him? I have more evidence of his criminal activity if you need it." "Ma'am, there won't be any arrests today," Sergeant Rodriguez said carefully. "But you should be aware that filing false police reports is a serious matter. You might want to consider consulting with an attorney." Karen's face showed confusion and growing concern. "What do you mean, false reports?" "Everything I told you is true." Officer Chen got into his patrol car without responding. As they drove away, Karen stood in Marcus's driveway, apparently unsure of what had just happened. Marcus watched from his window as Karen finally walked back to her house, her confident stride replaced by an uncertain shuffle. She had no idea that her call to the police had just triggered a full federal investigation into her HOA operations, complete with forensic accounting and potential criminal charges. The war Karen thought she was winning was about to become a battle she couldn't possibly survive. By Friday afternoon, Marcus's quiet neighborhood had been transformed into a federal investigation site. 3 black SUVs were parked on the street, and agents in business suits were going door-to-door interviewing residents. A forensic accounting team had set up a temporary office in the community clubhouse, and Karen's house was under surveillance. Marcus watched from his front window as Karen paced frantically in her driveway, making phone call after phone call. She had clearly realized that something had gone terribly wrong, but she still didn't understand the full scope of what was happening. Around 2 p.m., Marcus's supervisor, Director Sarah Chen, arrived at his house with 2 additional investigators. "Marcus, you've certainly stirred up a hornet's nest here," she said, settling into his living room with a thick file folder. "We've been here less than 24 hours and we've already found enough irregularities to keep us busy for months." "What did the initial financial review show?" Marcus asked. "Your neighbor Karen has been very creative with other people's money," replied Agent Williams, the lead financial investigator. "The HOA has collected over $340,000 in fees and fines over the past 3 years. We can only account for about $89,000 in legitimate expenses. The rest seems to have disappeared into various consulting fees, administrative costs, and management expenses." Director Chen opened her folder. "It gets worse. We found that Karen has been operating 3 different companies that all receive payments from the HOA. Neighborhood Standards Consulting, community management services, and residential compliance solutions. She's been essentially triple billing the HOA for the same services. Have you interviewed other residents yet? Marcus asked. That's where this gets really ugly, said Agent Martinez, the second investigator. We've talked to 47 households so far. 31 of them have been fined by the HOA in the past year, with total penalties exceeding $67,000. Most of the violations are for things that aren't actually against any written rules. Agent Williams pulled out a photograph. This family was charged $800 for having non-conforming holiday decorations. Their violation? They hung Christmas lights that were white instead of multicolored. There's nothing in the HOA bylaws about light color requirements. Another family was fined $1,200 for excessive pet noise, added Agent Martinez. Their dog barked twice when the mailman came. Karen counted each bark as a separate violation. Director Chen shook her head. The most disturbing case we found was an elderly man named Robert Kim. He's been fighting cancer for the past year, and during his chemotherapy treatments, he wasn't able to maintain his lawn perfectly. Karen fined him $2,400 for grass height violations and threatened foreclosure when he couldn't pay. The stress contributed to a heart attack that put him in the hospital for 2 weeks. Marcus felt anger building in his chest. Please tell me we can help Mr. Kim. We've already contacted his attorney, Director Chen assured him. All fines imposed by this HOA are likely to be declared invalid once our investigation is complete. Mr. Kim will get his money back, plus damages. Around 4 p.m., there was a knock at Marcus's door. Agent Williams looked out the window and grinned. Speaking of the devil, your neighbor Karen is here and she looks like she has something to say. Marcus opened the door to find Karen standing on his porch, but she looked nothing like the confident HOA president who had been harassing him all week. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes were red, and her hands were shaking. Marcus, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, we need to talk. Actually, Mrs. Whitfield, I don't think we do, Marcus replied. If you have something to discuss, you should speak with the federal investigators who are handling your case. Please, Karen pleaded. I know you're behind all this. Just tell me what you want. I can fix the violations. I can reduce the fines. We can work something out. Director Chen appeared behind Marcus. Mrs. Whitfield, I'm Director Sarah Chen with the Federal Housing Administration. You should know that you're currently under investigation for multiple federal violations, including fraud, embezzlement, and violations of fair housing practices. Karen's face went pale. I want to speak with my lawyer. That's certainly your right, Director Chen replied. You should also know that we'll be executing a search warrant for your home and business records tomorrow morning. I'd suggest you make that lawyer call soon. As Karen stumbled back toward her house, Agent Martinez came around from the backyard. Director, you need to see this. Mrs. Whitfield apparently keeps very detailed records of her neighborhood surveillance activities. He handed Director Chen a stack of photographs and documents. She has files on every resident, including daily activity logs, photographs taken from her windows, and what appears to be a rating system for how much trouble each neighbor causes her. Marcus looked through some of the photos. Karen had been documenting her neighbors' lives with an almost stalker-like intensity. There were pictures of people checking their mail, children playing in yards, and cars parked in driveways, all with timestamps and detailed notes about potential violations. The most concerning part, Agent Martinez continued, is that she seems to have been targeting specific families. Single mothers, elderly residents, and minorities received significantly more violations than other neighbors. Director Chen sighed. That adds civil rights violations to our investigation. This just keeps getting worse for her. That evening, Marcus finally had a chance to walk around his neighborhood and talk to other residents. The mood was dramatically different from the fearful atmosphere that had existed under Karen's reign of HOA terror. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who had been appointed to the board, was in her front yard watering flowers. She looked up as Marcus approached. Oh, Mr. Thompson, she said with a smile. I hear you're some kind of government investigator. Is it true that Karen won't be bothering us anymore? The investigation is ongoing, Marcus replied carefully. But I think you'll find that things are going to change around here. Good, Mrs. Patterson said firmly. That woman has been making everyone's life miserable. Do you know she fined me $300 because my grandson's bicycle was visible from the street when he came to visit? She said children's toys weren't allowed in front yards, even temporarily. As Marcus continued his walk, he met more neighbors who shared similar stories. A young father who had been fined for his children's chalk drawings on the sidewalk. A working mother who received violations because her work schedule prevented her from bringing in her garbage cans before 7 a.m. A veteran who was charged $500 for displaying an American flag that was allegedly the wrong size by Saturday morning. Word had spread throughout the neighborhood that Karen's HOA enforcement days were over. Residents were coming out of their houses, talking to neighbors they hadn't spoken to in months, and beginning to organize their own response to years of harassment and financial abuse. Marcus received a text message from Agent Williams at 8:30 a.m. Search warrant executed. You need to see what we found. When Marcus arrived at the community clubhouse, which had been converted into the investigation headquarters, he found the forensic team surrounded by boxes of documents, computer equipment, and what appeared to be surveillance equipment. Marcus, this is unbelievable, Director Chen said, holding up a thick binder. Karen kept detailed records of everything. Financial transactions, enforcement strategies, even psychological profiles of residents she considered problematic. Agent Williams pointed to a computer screen displaying spreadsheets. She had a quota system. She was trying to generate at least $5,000 per month in fines to maintain her consulting fee payments to herself. When violations were low, she would create new rules or reinterpret existing ones to meet her targets. Look at this, Agent Martinez added, holding up a printed email. She was in contact with a company called Maximum Enforcement Solutions that trains HOA boards to extract maximum revenue from residents through aggressive fine structures. They literally sent her templates for creating violations. Marcus examined the email chain. The correspondence showed Karen learning techniques for photographing minor infractions, writing violation notices that were difficult to dispute, and structuring fines to make legal challenges expensive and time-consuming. She was also coordinating with at least 6 other HOA presidents in the region, Director Chen continued. They were sharing strategies and celebrating their success in forcing out residents who couldn't afford the fines. The most disturbing discovery was a document labeled Problem Residence Removal Strategy. Karen had identified 15 families she wanted to force out of the neighborhood, including detailed plans for how to accumulate enough violations and fines to drive them into foreclosure. Marcus recognized several names on the list, including Mr. Kim, the cancer patient, and a young military family whose husband was deployed overseas. Karen had apparently seen the wife struggle to maintain the property alone as an opportunity to create violations. There's more, Agent Williams said grimly. We found evidence that she was taking photographs inside people's homes when they left their curtains open. She was using these photos to cite them for interior violations like having visible clutter or unapproved decorations. Around noon, Marcus saw Karen being escorted from her house in handcuffs. She was crying and shouting something about how she was just trying to protect the neighborhood's property values. Neighbors had gathered on their front lawns to watch, but there was no satisfaction in their faces, just relief that the ordeal was finally over. That afternoon, Marcus attended an impromptu neighborhood meeting in the community park. Over 60 residents showed up, many bringing their own files of violation notices and correspondence with Karen. What happens now? Asked David Rodriguez, a father of 2 who had been fined repeatedly for his children's toys being visible from the street. The federal investigation will continue, Marcus explained. All fines and fees collected through illegal means will be returned to residents. The HOA's current structure will likely be dissolved, and if you choose to form a new one, it will need to comply with federal guidelines. What about our legal fees? Asked Susan Chen, who had spent over $3,000 trying to fight Karen's violations. I had to take out a loan to pay my attorney. Those costs will be included in the restitution calculations, Director Chen assured her, having joined the meeting. Mrs. Whitfield's personal assets will be seized to compensate residents for the damages she caused. An elderly man named Frank raised his hand. I want to know how this went on for so long. Didn't anyone in city government know what was happening? Marcus exchanged glances with Director Chen. That's part of our investigation, too. We're looking into whether local officials received complaints about the HOA and failed to act appropriately. The meeting continued for over 2 hours, with residents sharing their experiences and beginning to plan for a healthier community structure. Several people thanked Marcus personally, though most still didn't know his exact role in bringing down Karen's operation. As the sun began to set, Marcus walked back to his house passing Karen's home, which now had federal seizure notices posted on the doors and windows. Her perfect lawn was already showing signs of neglect, and her surveillance cameras had been removed by the investigation team. For the first time in months, the neighborhood felt peaceful. Children were playing in yards without fear of creating violations. Residents were chatting across fence lines, and the atmosphere of constant surveillance and threat had been replaced by something resembling an actual community. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Director Chen. Final count, $127,000 in illegal fines to be returned to residents. Karen faces up to 15 years in federal prison, neighborhood finally free. 6 months later, Marcus stood in his front yard watching his neighbor's children play soccer on the street without any fear of violation notices. The transformation of Meadowbrook Heights had been remarkable, but the legal consequences for Karen Whitfield were still unfolding. Karen had been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for fraud, embezzlement, and civil rights violations. The judge had been particularly harsh after hearing testimony from the 15 families Karen had specifically targeted for removal from the neighborhood. Her personal assets, including her house, car, and business equipment, had been sold to provide restitution to the residents she had victimized. The neighborhood had chosen to dissolve the HOA entirely rather than reform it. A simple majority vote had eliminated all the restrictive covenants and returned the community to basic city ordinances. Property values had actually increased since Karen's removal, as word spread that Meadowbrook Heights was now a desirable place to live, without oppressive homeowner association restrictions. Mr. Kim, the cancer patient who had been nearly driven to foreclosure, had recovered both his health and his finances. The $2,400 in illegal fines had been returned with interest, and he received an additional $15,000 in damages for the medical complications caused by Karen's harassment. He had become one of Marcus's closest friends in the neighborhood. "Marcus, you saved this place," Mr. Kim said during one of their weekly coffee meetings. "I honestly thought I was going to lose my house while I was fighting for my life." "You would have fought back eventually," Marcus replied. "Karen just picked the wrong person to mess with when she targeted me." The investigation had revealed that Karen's operation was part of a larger network of predatory HOA management. The Federal Housing Administration had opened investigations into 47 other communities across 12 states, all connected to the Maximum Enforcement Solutions training company that had coached HOA boards on aggressive fine collection strategies. Marcus's role in exposing the scheme had earned him a promotion to Senior Director of Community Standards Enforcement. His new position involved traveling around the country to investigate similar HOA abuse cases and help communities restructure their governance in healthier ways. The house next to Karen's former residence had been purchased by a young family with twin toddlers. Marcus smiled every time he saw the children's toys scattered across the front lawn, knowing that no one would ever again measure grass height with a ruler or photograph temporary violations from behind curtained windows. Director Chen had visited the neighborhood several times during the investigation's follow-up phases. During her last visit, she and Marcus walked through the community park where the residents' meeting had taken place months earlier. "You know, Marcus, this case has become a model for how federal housing enforcement should work," she said. "We've used the documentation from Karen's operation to train investigators in 6 other regions. What's the status of the other HOAs in the network?" Marcus asked. 31 have been shut down entirely. 12 more are operating under federal oversight while they restructure. 4 HOA presidents have been criminally charged, and 2 more are negotiating plea agreements. They paused at a bench where Marcus often saw elderly Mrs. Patterson feeding ducks with her visiting grandchildren. She had recovered the $300 she was charged for her grandson's bicycle and had become an advocate for other seniors dealing with HOA harassment in nearby communities. "The most important thing," Director Chen continued, "is that we've established legal precedent. Other federal prosecutors can now use our case files to pursue similar investigations. Karen may have thought she was just bullying her neighbors, but she accidentally helped us shut down a nationwide scheme." Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Agent Williams. "Karen's appeal denied. Full sentence stands. Asset recovery 100% complete." That evening, Marcus hosted a barbecue in his backyard for the first time since moving to Meadowbrook Heights. 23 neighbors showed up, bringing food, stories, and their children. The atmosphere was relaxed and genuine, with none of the tension that had characterized the neighborhood during Karen's reign. David Rodriguez, whose children had been repeatedly cited for playing in their own yard, brought his guitar and led an impromptu sing-along. Susan Chen, who had spent thousands fighting Karen's violations, organized games for the kids. Even Bill, Karen's former next-door neighbor who had served on her rubber stamp board, attended and apologized to several residents for not speaking up sooner. I was scared of her too, Bill admitted to Marcus. She knew where I worked, knew my schedule, knew everything about my family. I felt like if I crossed her, she'd make my life impossible. That was her strategy, Marcus replied. She wanted everyone to feel isolated and afraid so they wouldn't organize against her. As the evening wound down, Marcus found himself reflecting on how a simple furniture delivery had led to exposing a multi-state criminal operation. If Karen had simply been a reasonable neighbor, if she had enforced rules fairly and transparently, if she hadn't let power corrupt her completely, she would still be living next door instead of serving 8 years in federal prison. The irony wasn't lost on him that Karen's obsession with controlling her neighbors had ultimately led to her losing control of everything in her own life. Her house, her freedom, her reputation, and her financial security had all been destroyed by her own actions. Mrs. Patterson stopped by as she was walking home from the barbecue. "Marcus, I have a question for you," she said with a mischievous smile. "Now that we don't have an HOA anymore, is there anything stopping me from painting my front door bright purple?" Marcus laughed. "Mrs. Patterson, as long as the city doesn't have a problem with it, you can paint your door any color you want." "Good," she replied with satisfaction. "I've always wanted a purple door, but Karen told me it would ruin everyone's property values." 6 months after Karen had called the cops on Marcus, thinking she could intimidate him into compliance, she was sitting in a federal prison cell while her former neighbors were finally free to live their lives, without fear of arbitrary fines and surveillance. The neighborhood Karen had claimed to protect with her extreme enforcement had become everything she said it couldn't be without strict HOA control. Property values were up, crime was down, neighbors knew each other's names, and children played outside without generating violation notices. Marcus never revealed to most of his neighbors that he was the federal official responsible for taking down their HOA president. As far as they knew, he was just a quiet consultant who had been brave enough to stand up to a bully. Sometimes the best justice happens when people don't even know they're watching it unfold. The last entry in Marcus's case file read, "Subject neutralized. Community restored. Mission accomplished."